Welcome back to my channel Famous and Fabulous was initiated. They believed that to be a 10-day wonder. Everyone believed that rock and roll would end when it first began. Well, rock and roll artists were really awesome. Imagine this. It's the late 70s, with a band playing in the background. Mick Jagger is sitting in a velvet-lined dressing room, draped in silk, and sipping a scotch. He grimaced at the sound rather than the drink. They're trying too hard, not because they're noisy. Mick detested the bands that constantly attempted to outdo the Stones. Jagger's resentments went deep, but he wasn't always vocal about them. His charm served as a cover for Rivalry, Dishonesty, and others who imitated grandeur without merit. Additionally, his hatred of a band was acute and irreversible. Mick Jagger couldn't stand these 6 bands, and he explains why. The band that he believed took themselves far too seriously arrived first. The Doors. Jim Morrison's tortured poet routine didn't appeal to Jagger. He mistook it for theatrical, overblown and forced. The Stones were extravagant, but they never feigned knowledge. The Doors, in Jagger's view, ultimately failed in their attempt to combine music with spirituality. During overlapping tours in 1968, the Rivalry reached its zenith. Jagger, who regarded professionalism as a mark of honor, was irritated by Morrison's inconsistent actions. Morrison reportedly arrived hours late and stumbled on stage during a Los Angeles gig, causing the entire evening to be delayed. Mick, who appreciated control even in turmoil, was enraged by something. Tensions were rising. Backstage, roadies said that Mad Morrison and Jagger were fighting over who would close a joint event. The Doors asserted their poetic heritage. History was asserted by the Stones. Neither gave in. The Doors were disregarded by Jagger as a band because they were too enamored with their own mystique. He believed that Morrison's theatrical presence was an overly egotistical charade. When Mick only wanted rock to shake the earth, he regarded the Doors as a band frantically attempting to turn a profit. Jagger saw the conflict with the Doors as a quintessential example of movement versus mood. Additionally, the fog that attempted to obstruct his fire was never forgiven by him. A bandmate known as Marketing Plan in Leather suddenly appeared. Give Jagger a kiss. Rock wasn't Kiss. It was a guitar-playing toy line. He was offended by their face paint fireworks and bombast. He thought props weren't necessary for a genuine theatrical presence. It needs soul. As Kiss's fame skyrocketed, in the late 1970s, Jagger became enraged by the frequent parallels, and the journalists referring to them as the next Stones. He took it personally and didn't merely disagree. Because you truly need your ego to cope with the audience and deal with situations when the Stones bleed charm and danger, you become somewhat more egocentric when you're traveling, for example. He thought Kiss was hiding behind comic book flair and smoke machines. When a promoter proposed that the Stones and Kiss co-headline a huge stadium tour in the US, the Rivalry soured. Jagger abruptly stopped it, allegedly declaring that he would not perform on the same stage as a circus performance. The Cold War grew more intense after that. Exhibits and industrial events at a wart. Mick stayed away from the Kiss entourage, like the plague. Jagger's contempt was further stoked years later when Gene Simmons joked about the Stones' aging and diminishing significance in a tabloid interview. Mick would call Kiss a band more interested in action figures than anthems, clowns in boots, behind closed doors. Jagger believed that although they had packed arenas, they had done so with spectacle rather than song. And that was the loudest lie rock could make, in his opinion. The band that sounded like a voiceless echo followed. A paradise. Oasis's devotion to the Stone wasn't the only thing. The arrogance was the cause. Jagger and Richards were frequently mentioned by the Gallagher brothers as icons, but they also insisted that they were superior. It went too far for Mick. Jagger was furious on the inside, but kept quiet in public throughout the British pop explosion of the 1990s. He said that Oasis disregarded the Stones' decades-old template and instead pretended to have created rebellion. Rumour had it that Jagger thought of them as posers dressed in old clothing who were living off of someone else's mythology. When Oasis started making subtle jabs at older bands in interviews that appeared to be directed at the Stones, tensions increased. When Oasis took the stage at a 1996 Music Awards ceremony, Mick allegedly left the room. Security personnel observed the tension backstage. There was only chilly air between the camps. No eye contact, no words. Noel Gallagher's notorious assertion that Oasis was larger than the Stones was what cemented the resentment. That was sacrilege, not just bravado. According to reports, Mick stormed out of the room after throwing a drink. Oasis wasn't simply a bother after that. To Jagger, they were the epitome of contempt. They were a shadow that thought it was a storm, a tribute band with a superiority complex. Then there was the band that, in his opinion, equated power with noise. Grunge is never warm to Nirvana Jagger. Although Nirvana's anti-glam philosophy conflicted with everything the Stones had created, including swagger, spectacle, and showmanship, Kurt nonetheless appreciated the movement's unadulterated energy. Nirvana pulled chaos across the floor like a wound that was bleeding, until the Stones transformed it into choreography. There was more than just a stylistic distinction. It was a culture war. When Nirvana became the new face of rebellion in the early 90s, Jagger felt the sting of erasure. Magazine profiles Kurt Cobain, the new voice of a generation, subtly implying that Jagger's time was past. That message didn't sit well. Tensions erupted backstage at the 1992 MTV Awards when Jagger and full Nirvana members were positioned in adjacent green rooms. Insiders believed that Jagger stayed away from any contact, saying he had no desire to participate in a eulogy for amusement. Kurt Cobain wasn't hated by him, he gave him a pimple. However, he detested how the media elevated Nirvana to the status of rock's new gold standard, as though the past needed to be destroyed to create space. Jagger's contempt was further cemented when Nirvana fans made fun of more established bands like the Stones for being ostentatious and conceited. He believed that Nirvana had robbed rock of its pleasure, and he could not forgive it. They were grim in addition to being noisy. Additionally, rock was meant to excite rather than depress, another object of Jagger's disdain in Mick's world. He thought the band was emotionally dull and unduly complex, chief of the radio. Jagger was an admirer of development, but not at the expense of emotion. He was annoyed by Radiohead's intellectually curious attitude to rock. He believed that music was created to be analyzed rather than experienced. For him, it was formulaic feeling rather than instinct. The music was composed with reviewers, not audiences, in mind. Radiohead regularly swept categories that had previously been controlled by the Stones in the award circuits in the early 2000s. Jagger loathed the change after sensing it. It seemed, to him, that code, algorithms, and sound analysis were taking the place of genuine charisma and emotional fervor. Although there was no overt conflict, there were several tense moments. Jagger was supposed to attend a Radiohead set at one significant event, but he left early after their lengthy soundcheck caused him to miss his own practice. Word quickly got out. He made fun of their lyrics in secret while reading their diaries, beneath strobe lights. Another spark was created when a journalist suggested that Kid A's work was antiquated in comparison to Exile on Main Saint Calling V, which was once a masterwork of contemporary alienation. According to reports, Jagger was incensed because he believed it to be erasure by elevation. He didn't despise them for being there. He detested the fact that when reviewers listened, they lost their ability to feel. Furthermore, he believes that no band should ever require a decoder ring to get people to move. Lastly, he believed that the band embodied all that was manufactured about contemporary music. Coldplay. They were deemed safe by Mick. That was the most offensive thing he had ever said. Coldplay's crowd-pleasing melodies and pastel hues struck him as meaningless music that was meant to offend no one. The disdain began subtly, but became more audible behind closed doors. Jagger allegedly became enraged and referred to it as a watered-down era of rock when Coldplay was asked to play as the main act at Glastonbury, the same year the Stones were passed over. He perceived their appeal as surrender rather than success. They were a band formed to console rather than to challenge. At a charity function, Jagger and Chris Martin were introduced backstage. Sources claimed that the conversation was chilly and short. Jagger turned away after giving a phony smile. Later that evening, he was heard referring to Coldplay as the musical equivalent of airline cuisine, which was provided to everyone but nobody could recall. He blasted any naysayers who referred to this generation of stadium titans as Coldplay. That comparison was offensive to him, in addition to being incorrect. Sweat, scandal, and survival were all things the Stones had clawed their way through. According to Jagger, Coldplay had succeeded through marketing and melody. Empires were founded on risk by the Stones. Comfort was the foundation of Coldplay's. Furthermore, MC Jagger believed that there was no greater sin. Jagger is fearless. After striking, he smiles. However, there was always a storm beneath the charm. His goals weren't limited to just 6 bands. They served as challenges to the throne, threats, or worse, reminders of what he thought rock may turn into. Overpolished, diluted, or devoid of threat. For Mick, rock was more than simply music. It has to do with spectacle, perspiration, and sex. It was all about charisma, mayhem, and command. He didn't want a band's name close to his if they couldn't bring that to the stage. He considered himself a guardian of what in addition to being a performer, a legacy that was impossible to produce. Thus, he maintained his prominence, not by being the loudest, but rather by being the most sardonic, the most unrepentant, and the one who maintained a smile when others broke. He saw bands come and go, hailed as the next big thing by young people, acclaimed by critics. Even yet, no one could match his bite, burn, or glide. He saw them like gusts in a storm, and he understood why. The thunder was he. They would never have his gait. Never would they be him. Because Jagger was more than just a music star. Anyone who dared to withstand the beat was challenged by him, who was its pulse.